Hey guys, so today we'll cover XVA in the sense we have heard about XVA in a lot of places, and I'm not going to go into the details of the models and the calculations because it's very subjective to each of the bank, but we'll talk about the global framework and what are the parts of XVA, what are the components of XVA. So X stands for anything like it could be CVA, a credit value adjustment, a debit value adjustment, for funding cost adjustment, collateral adjustment. So we don't know what kind of adjustment we are talking about. So that's how it's called as XVA, or it could be the X could be signifying a lot of other adjustments because different banks and different geographies apply these adjustments as per the framework they have adopted. So banks who have completely adopted the Basel III framework will have all these components. But if it's a less mature market like India or an emerging market wherein the funding cost adjustment and the funding benefit adjustment, the FTP pricing for transferring the cost, the transferring the funding cost from one desk to another desk is not computed in the trading price, they might use some of the components. So that's why it's termed as an XVA. So, in generally, what is XVA? So, we have just put a brief paragraph. Let me read it out. So, it can be broadly termed as an adjustment to the market valuation that includes adjustment for cost of credit risk, cost of capital, and cost of margin, if any. So what we do in market valuation, right? In the market valuation, we are comparing the market risk. The market risk. We are just taking the market risk of the security, whether the security has a mark-to-market gain or a mark-to-market loss. But we have seen, especially post 2008, that credit risk was ignored in the models, and that was the main reason why the defaults had a domino effect across the derivative positions in the world. So that's where after 2008 the Basel III guidelines have come up, and they have included a lot of adjustments specifically targeting the credit risk and also the cost of capital and margin. So XVA can be further bifurcated into CVA, which is credit value adjustment, DVA, it's a mirror image of credit value adjustment. FCA is funding cost adjustment. FBA is the funding benefit adjustment. COL-VA or collateral valuation adjustment is it's very fairly simple. KVA is the regulatory capital adjustment, and MVA is the margin value adjustment. So these are some basic definitions for the breakdown. So CVA is counterparty or issuer credit risk. The credit risk that you have by having an exposure to a counterparty. Like someone would have an exposure to Lehman Brothers, and Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. So that kind of a credit risk which they are having on their books. DVA is your own credit risk because I said it's a opposite of CVA. So when you have a counterparty credit risk as CVA, your own default risk becomes a DVA. That's a debit value adjustment. Then we have FCA and FBA, that is cost of funding in the money and out of the money position. This is specifically for the uncollateralized positions, right? So we will see in the detail when we move to the FCA and FBA. For now, just understand that FCA and FBA is the cost of funding the in the money and the out of money positions in derivatives. The next is COL-VA, which is the collateral valuation adjustment. This is basically on either side, adjustments on either side due to movement in collateral market value. So you know that in derivatives or any secure transaction wherein you're providing a collateral, if the mark to market value of that contract or the collateral moves up and down, you'll have to post more collateral, or you can you can be over collateralized in case you want. But as per the valuation of the contract and the underlying collateral, there could be changes in the valuation of the overall contract. KVA is the cost to maintain regulatory capital as the collateral. So this is basically the regulatory burden. So in the sense, let's take an example of LCR, liquidity coverage ratio, or NSFR. It is the amount of capital or the percentage of capital that you need to keep in highly liquid and high quality assets, and that is required to absorb losses. So that could be, and that capital cannot be used anywhere by the bank. So that capital is tied up. Since it's tied up, it's a cost to the bank. It is an opportunity cost lost by the bank by not deploying that cash. Hence, it becomes a valuation adjustment. The adjustment has to take in the cost, that is cost for the amount which is tied up as a regulatory capital. MVA is the margin value adjustment. It's again cost and benefit on each side due to margin value adjustment. So MVA and COL-VA is more or less similar. We'll see the difference or the differences in the later slides. In essence, you can understand that mark-to-market valuation, which is the market risk plus the XVA adjustments, is the fair value of the contract or security. So if someone is asking you what is the market value of the security and what is the fair value of the security, the difference between them will be your XVA adjustment or the capital adjustment for credit risk and regulatory cost and margin risk. So that's a very crude statement just to make you understand from a logic perspective as to what is how do you arrive at the fair value of any derivative position. So this is just a definition. So we move to the CVA and DVA. So CVA can be broadly defined as the mark-to-market losses due to the deterioration of the credit worthiness of the counterparty. That is the credit spreads that we have understood that you have if you have a exposure to a counterparty who is likely to default, you will lose that money. So CVA adjustment has to be done. DVA is exactly opposite. It can be defined as the mark-to-market losses due to deterioration of your own credit worthiness. Like if say suppose Bank of America also had a lot of issuance in the market. So and since Bank of America was also involved in those CDS selling and this CLO sellings, their own risk to other counterparties is known as the DVA. So that risk is also counted in their adjustment. This is mainly applied for derivative exposures and bonds other than risk-free bonds. Obviously, risk-free bonds are guaranteed by the central government or the sovereign government. So we'll take an Excel example also, but I just want you to make note of the important points over here. So components of CVA are three main components: PD, which is probability of issuer or counterparty default; RR is the recovery rate; DR is the default rate; EE is the expected exposure. Okay. So we'll take these components in a realistic sense and try to make a example out of it. So over here we have a 4-year annual coupon paying bond quoting at 7%. The current LIBOR or the discount rate is at 2.5%, which is RFR, risk free rate 2.5%, which has no risk embedded into it. We have a counterparty whose probability of default based on their current CDS pricing is 2%. And if the counterparty defaults, I will be able to recover 42% of that exposure, which is known as the recovery rate. And 100 minus 42 is obviously 58% is the default rate. So if I have $100 exposure to the counterparty, if I have $100 exposure to the counterparty, I will lose $58 because that's the default rate given. So if I have $100 counterparty exposure, 58% of that is what I will lose because that is the default rate. So into 58% is the expected loss. Okay, so this is the contract that we have entered into. Some problem with this pen today. Okay, now this bond will have 4 annual payments. So let's say I'm invested today at $100. I have payment coming in year one, year two, year three, and year four. Right, these payments are coming in. Okay, I have fixed my mouse problem. Yeah, so these are the 4 coupon payments that are coming in the next future. So investment at T0 is $100. These are the components of coupon which is going to come, and at the maturity, I will get back my coupon plus my $100. So standing at year one, exposure for the first coupon will be $7, right? Because it's an annual coupon payment. So I'll take $7 as the exposure. For the year two, it will get discounted for 1 year. For the year three, it will get discounted for 2 years. Again, same for the year four, it will get discounted for 3 years. So this way, I've written over here future cash flow discounted as cash flow upon 1 plus YTM raised to n. So what do we have as YTM is 2.5% raised to n. N is the number of years. So first year exposure is $7. Second year is $7 for discounted for 1 year. $7 discounted for 2 year. 107 discounted for 3 year. In the year two, my year one coupon has already gone. I have the second coupon which I am likely to achieve $7. The exposure for third year coupon will be again discounted by 1 year. Same over here. In the year three, year one, and year two have gone. I have a $7 exposure and I have a 1 year discounted of 107. Then in the fourth year, I have an entire exposure of 107. So this is more from an exposure perspective, a very, very nominal way of explaining this thing. So now we'll come to the Excel part of it and see what is happening. So I have the same example in Excel, and this was the contract terms, right? Now in the year one, what is my expected exposure? My expected exposure for year one will be the sum of all the future exposure. My expected exposure will be sum of all future exposure. So 120 will be the sum of this. Similarly, in year two will be this, year three will be this, year four will be this. This is pretty straightforward expected exposure. Then what is the probability of default? We know that probability of default is 2%. Now, if a counterparty has not defaulted in the first year, the likeliness of it defaulting in the second year will reduce because they have not defaulted in the past. So 1.96 is less than 2. In the year 3, they have not defaulted. In the previous years, it goes down. In the year 4, it goes more down. It goes to 1.88. So there is a formula for it, which is survival probability raised to n into probability of default. Simply, it is saying that since you have not defaulted in the past, your future probability of default is reduced. And the formula to arrive at the PD is basically survival probability over here, which will be 98% raised to n, that will be 2 into 2%, right? So, this way you will get the value. Discounting factor. What is the discounting factor? It's very simple. We have been doing it across all our life for people who are really doing the bond valuation, all those things. For the year one, I'll have the YTM raised to 1. For the year two, I will have the YTM raised to 2. For the year three, I'll have the YTM raised to 3. Similarly, for the year four, I'll have the YTM raised to 4. Now, there is an important concept over here of LGD, which is a loss given default. The common terms used is LGD in the market. Loss given default is simply expected exposure into the default rate. So we understood initially that if the counterparty defaults, then 58% of the exposure will be lost. If the counterparty defaults, then 58% of the exposure will be lost. So over here we have lost 58%. 58% of 120 is 69.51. So if the counterparty defaults, then what will be the loss? Hence the name loss given default. Loss given default. It is simply expected exposure into the default rate. If you see this slide, we have written over here loss given default is default rate into the exposure. Exposure is 120 over here. Default rate is 58%. Simply multiplication of both is the loss that I will have. Similarly for year 2, year 3 and year 4. EL is the expected loss. What is the expected loss? But this will be the loss if I default. But what is the probability of me defaulting? For the year 1, the probability of me defaulting is only 2% or the counterparty defaulting is only 2%. So $69 will be your loss if there is a default given the probability is 100%. But what is the probability over here? The probability is 2%. So 2% of 69 is $1.39. Similarly for year 2, similarly for year 3, similarly for year 4. That's what we have written here. The expected loss is PD into LGD. So what is PD? PD is 2%. LGD is 69.51. The multiplication of both is your expected loss. Now this expected loss is in future. This expected loss is in future. Why? Because I am having a future exposure on this bond. So the future exposure needs to be computed on present value. So how do I compute? I can either discount it by multiplying it by 1 by the YTM, or I can just simply multiply it with the discount factor. It means the same thing. I could have simply done 1.39 into 1 divided by 1.25, or I can just simply multiply this one. So this is the PV of ECL. I have a ECL, but this is all future exposure. As of now, if you want to adjust the cost, I have to discount it back at the risk-free rate. At the risk-free rate or the discount rate. So PV of ECL, for each cash flow I'll do PV of ECL. The sum of that PV of ECL will be CVA. The sum of that PV of ECL will be my CVA. Now, I hope this is clear. I will. You can pause and again go back, but it's a fairly simple calculation. Now, what are we going to do? We'll just see another concept over here that if the bond, I had to remove the price of the bond. If I had to remove the price of the bond, I would have just done a PV of the bond and I could have got the value $117. Okay. Price of the bond quoted in the market is $117, but I am not going to pay that much of cost to the counterparty, or I'm going to adjust the cost. I will adjust the cost based on the CVA. So if $117 is the counterparty's quoted market price, my risk adjusted value should be 112.85. So this is the CVA adjusted price. This is the credit risk adjusted price. So this is the probable loss that I might have to bear. If you do the reverse calculation, you will also get the same amount. And now you can arrive that from 112.85 is the price, then what should be my yield? My yield should be 3.7. The market yield is how much? The market yield is how much? 2.5. But if I arrive at the yield using this price by using the yield method of calculation or rate method, I'm having a higher yield. So this is my credit spread. How do I arrive at the credit spread? Is simply YTM on risky bond, YTM of risky bond minus YTM of risk-free bond is the credit spread. YTM of risky bond, if I take the consideration of value of the bond minus the CVA is this. When I put this as the price and I compute the yield, I get 3.7. Now 3.7 is much more higher than 2.5, which is getting quoted in the market. So this is the counterparty credit spread. This is important. This is if the banks automate this thing, it was very beneficial for them. So this was more from a CVA perspective. Let's move on to the other components. Then we have the FCA and the FBA. And over here, I've put a note that funding valuation adjustment is sum of FCA, FBA, and funding buffer. That is the extra cushion. So, what is FCA? Now, FCA and FBA is only applicable to uncollateralized derivative. Uncollateralized derivative. Over here, I've put a note. So, we'll start from this point. Most large counterparties or corporates don't have CSA and hence their exposure are uncollateralized exposure for the bank. Now, if two banks are dealing in counterpart in a derivative instrument, most of the there are high chances that most of the banks will be ISDA. They must have signed the ISDA agreement and they have a CSA in place. CSA is credit support annex. It's a very simple thing in a broader sense. It just makes sure that there are rules and regulations and the threshold levels that are defined for posting of collateral in case there is a mark to market loss on the position or a credit loss on the position. So what will happen? Let's say an example Tesla, right? Tesla is a very large corporate. Its market cap is I think so about $1 trillion. Okay, so Tesla wants to hedge its exposure, say to Chinese yuan or say to euro. For that matter, if they come to a bank, say they come to JP Morgan Bank, they come to JP Morgan Bank, and JP Morgan Bank obviously cannot deny Tesla for an derivative contract to hedge their exposure. Obviously, if JP is not going to do, someone else will do. So JP will obviously do. So what will these guys do? They have an exposure to a counterparty which is not member of CSA. So obviously, this exposure is uncollateralized. This exposure is uncollateralized. Now, since this is an uncollateralized exposure, someone needs to fund it. Someone needs to fund it because if Tesla, though Tesla might not default in any case, but there is a probability of default, right? There could be a probability that the counterparty will default. So funding adjustments are the own funding required to manage the uncollateralized derivative position, specifically if it is an ITM position. It is the cost the bank incurs to pay for funding the derivative position. That is the cost to keep the asset collateralized or pay for variation margin. As I told you earlier, these corporates like Tesla will not be part of the CSA, and hence their position will be uncollateralized. Their position will be uncollateralized. So the funding that the bank needs to keep in place, like say suppose 8% of the exposure needs to be kept as a collateral. This is an OTC derivative, obviously. So 8% of the exposure has to be kept as a collateral. Now, where will the bank get this 8%? Either the bank will borrow from their, maybe the subsidiary interbank, or from the directly from the interbank market. They will get a rate at which they will buy or fund this exposure. That rate is known as the funding cost, the cost that the bank has incurred. Over here, I've written another line also. FC also includes in some of the banks, not all the banks, the liquidity or the fund transfer pricing from the bank treasury, interbank market to the bank or branch. So let's take an example that Tesla approached, say the Chinese, maybe there is a hypothetical JP Morgan Chinese branch, which looks at, or Singapore branch. So they approach JP Morgan Singapore branch. Now Singapore branch JP Morgan can actually go in the interbank market and borrow or fund the money, right? Or they can go to their own JP Treasury in US, JP US, or JP, say, Euro, wherever they can go to fund that liability, fund that exposure. Now these guys who are getting the fund from their interbank market at X%, will add the cost to give to JP APAC, say X% plus some basis point, say plus Y. This is the fund transfer pricing, because these guys will make sure that they get some benefit for funding the APAC branch. So this fund pricing also adds to the cost adjustment for funding the position. So this is FCA. It's complicated in real sense, and it is very subjective because it is for the uncollateralized derivative position. And always remember this thing, why they are uncollateralized, because most of the large corporates or counterparties don't have a CSA they don't have a CSA in place. Obviously, they are corporates like Tesla will not have, Microsoft, Tesla, Twitter might not have CSAs, but we have seen that there are a lot of companies which are now signing up for CSAs. So that is FCA, and FBA is obviously the opposite of it. But let's go through it. The funding benefit adjustments are the funding benefit that bank gets by acquiring on liability. Uncollateralized may be interbank. Now, over here, bank was exposed to derivatives, wherein bank is providing the facility to enter into a derivative contract to a corporate. There could be a chance where the bank is also having an uncollateralized exposure, their own exposure to another bank. They have an uncollateralized exposure to another bank. Since it's an uncollateralized exposure, the bank who is lending, in this case, which was JP, now your JP is on this side, and there will be an X bank. Now, X bank has to do the FCA. Now X bank has to do the FCA because now we are the one who are having an liability. Now since we have the liability, but it's an uncollateralized contract, the bank who is having our exposure will have to do the funding cost adjustment. Now since the bank who has the exposure is doing the funding cost adjustments, we don't have to, the bank doesn't have to pay margin until threshold is reached. This acts as a funding savings for the bank. The bank can then use this cash for other investments avenues, hence adding benefit to the bank. The rate the bank gets when deploying this cash is computed as the FVA. It is simply opposite of this when you have your own exposure to another bank wherein the contract is uncollateralized. You will have a funding benefit adjustment and you don't have to fund that derivative position, and that cash can be used somewhere else. So that was more from an FVA. COL-VA is basically the collateral valuation adjustment. It's very straightforward in that sense. It is the cost or benefit due to the extent of receiving or posting collateral to a hedged derivative position. And in the money position will require no further funding, and hence the unused capital adds to the benefit of the overall position and is reduced from the overall cost. Collateral received against an ITM position will require the receiver to pay interest on over collateralized position at OIS swap rate. So if you have entered into a contract and you had X as the valuation, and then on the next day the valuation has gone to say 1.2x, and the threshold was say 1x. Now your 0.2x is over collateralized. Now if you are having more cash from the counterparty, that is then it is required to maintain the collateral, then the counterparty will ask for a interest on that over collateralized position. The interest is usually paid at the OIS swap rate. The interest is usually paid at the OIS swap rate. The reason is because these interests are mostly overnight, right? Because no bank will keep an over collateralized position with other bank, but they might keep it for one day or overnight. So it's usually paid at the OIS swap rate. The opposite is true as well, as any OTM position will require additional collateral posting in form of cash or very high liquid assets. This translates into cost to manage the overall position and is added to the overall cost. In practice, larger banks can also provide CTD, that is the cheapest to deliver bond. So this is just a comment. You can ignore this. It's just for academic purpose. So you have to understand that collateral, if it is over collateralized, the person who has over collateralized his exposure will ask for some benefit from the bank because he is over collateralized. He will ask the bank to pay him interest on the extra exposure, and that will be paid at the OIS swap rate. And the opposite is true. If it is underfunded, you'll have to fund it, and the cost that you require to fund it or the OIS swap rate, you will borrow at the OIS swap rate to fund that. So OIS becomes your cost. The next is KVA. K stands for capital. So banks are required to hold capital reserves to sustain any failure of the overall banking and trading crisis, to absorb credit, market, and operational risk losses. So specifically after 2008, the capital requirement has gone up. Every year it has gone up after 2008, and it is highest as of now, especially in the Basel III guidelines. As per the Basel III guidelines, KVA captures the cost of this additional regulatory capital. So this is very simple in that sense, but let me just explain. So if a bank has multiple lending assets and loans as the assets and all those things, they are entering into derivative position. Now what happens if these guys who are supposed to pay to the bank, they don't pay? That's what happened in 2008 crisis, right? Their exposure increased more than their net worth, in fact 2x than their net worth. So the bank has asked so regulator has asked the bank to keep some capital as a buffer with them or as in highly liquid assets which cannot be used anywhere else. I think so. It's at 8% as of now. So that amount is cannot be used anywhere else. There are other ratios also like LCR, which is the high quality assets. That is high quality asset that needs to be kept based on the stressed cash flow that can occur in the next 30 days. And then there is NSFR also. So there are various other ratios also. There are some intraday commitments and intraday liquidity commitments also. The Basel guidelines that also has to be kept. So in the nutshell, the cost or the opportunity cost lost due to the capital that is tied for regulatory capital is known as the KVA. MVA in that sense is very simple. All derivative contracts that are not cleared through CCP, Central Clearing Party, will require posting initial and variable margin. Obviously, because it is not cleared through Central Clearing House, then it will be requiring an initial and variable margin. MVA is the funding cost the bank incurs for posting the initial margin for derivative contracts. MVA is the cost that the bank incurs for posting the initial margin for derivative contracts. And I've made a comment over here that variable margin cost is overlapped in the broader sense as COL-VA, because if you see the definition of COL-VA is basically to fund the under collateralized or over collateralized position. So MVA in that sense is can be considered as the variable margin posting, the cost required to post the initial margin. So just holding on to the initial margin and these things, let us consider that bank A and bank B has entered into a contract for say 6 months, and says exposure is say $1 billion. So initial margin is say suppose 4% example, 4% will be, so I think so 40 million. Yeah, 40 million will be the exposure. So 40 million will be as the initial exposure, initial margin that the bank needs to keep. Now, if suppose this 1 billion goes up, if that 1 billion goes up or goes down, so frequently you'll have to post more margin or you can remove margin if you're over collateralized. That is known as the variable margin. That is the maintenance margin that you need to put throughout the cash flow, throughout the life of the cash flow. But MVA will mostly capture the initial margin cost at the time when you enter the contract. I think this is more or less an overview. We can actually go into a lot of detail for XVA, but this is more or less what I wanted to explain from a concept perspective. Thank you guys.